My name is Wren, and I was 30 years old when my mother told me that the $64,800 I had been depositing into her account for 6 years was, at the moment I actually needed it, tied up. My furnace had failed. It was January in Cleveland, Ohio. The repair estimate was $2,200. I had put $900 a month into what my mother called the Safe account, a joint savings account she managed, set aside specifically for situations exactly like this one. I had not touched it in 3 years.
I had not needed to.
I had built it for the moment I would. She said, "That money is tied up right now. You'll manage." I hung up the phone and sat on my couch in my coat because the house was 49 degrees and I was very still for a while. Not because I was upset, because I was finally letting myself think a thought I had been avoiding for about 2 years, and once I started thinking it, I couldn't stop. What I had in a folder on my laptop, and what I had never expected to need to use in front of anyone, turned out to be exactly what a room full of people needed to see about 8 weeks later.
I need you to stay with me for this one.
Welcome back to Chaniel, where quiet people keep records that rooms can't argue with. New here? Subscribe now, and if you've ever trusted a family member with something you couldn't afford to lose, drop a 7 in the comments. I want to tell you about the kind of person I am before I tell you what happened, because the kind of person I am is directly related to both why this was possible and why it took as long as it did to surface. I grew up in a mid-sized city in northeastern Ohio, the kind of place with a strong sense of itself, where people take pride in practical things, keeping a house in order, knowing your neighbors, showing up when something needs to be done. My parents had lived in the same house since before I was born. My father passed away when I was 22, a cardiac event, swift and without warning, the kind of loss that reorganizes everything about how a family understands itself. My mother, Glorine, was 54 when he died, and she handled it the way she handled most things, by reorganizing, by keeping busy, by becoming the center around which the remaining family orbited. There were 2 of us after my father, me, Wren, and my brother Deshawn, 3 years older. Deshawn had stayed in the area. He lived 40 minutes from my mother's house, worked as a site supervisor for a construction company, and had been married to his wife Tamsin for 7 years. They had 1 child, a daughter named Bria, who was 5 at the time this story reaches its center. Deshawn was present in the daily way that proximity allows. He drove my mother to appointments, helped with the yard, showed up when things broke. He was the family's physical presence. I was the financial one. I worked as a municipal budget analyst for the city of Cleveland. I had held this position for 6 years, having come to it through a master's in public administration and a genuine interest in the mechanics of how public money is allocated, tracked, and accounted for. The work requires a specific kind of patience. You are reading documents for the gaps between what was projected and what was spent, for the places where the numbers don't move the way they should, for the explanations that don't fully account for what they're explaining. I had done this for 6 years. I was, by any professional measure, good at it. I had a small house in Cleveland's west side that I had purchased at 26, a 2-bedroom bungalow that needed work when I bought it, and had steadily gotten less work needing over the years I'd lived in it. I drove a car I'd owned for 5 years, and intended to keep for 5 more. I kept my fixed costs low and my savings rate consistent because I had watched what happened when a family's financial stability depended on one person and that person was suddenly gone, and I had decided, at 22 standing at my father's funeral, that I was not going to be caught without a floor. This safe account had been my mother's idea. This is important. I want to be precise about the direction of the suggestion because it matters for understanding how the arrangement felt to me for a long time. My mother had proposed it 3 years after my father died, when I was 25 and had just started the municipal analyst position. She said she had been thinking about emergency preparedness, that the family had learned the hard way what it meant to not have liquid reserves, and she had a savings account she wasn't using that she could hold for me, separate from my regular savings, specifically for emergencies. She said she would manage it the way she had managed all the family finances since my father passed, carefully, conservatively, without touching it for anything other than its designated purpose.
I said yes.
I said yes because I trusted her completely because she had managed family finances for years without incident, and because the idea of having a separate emergency reserve held by someone else had a particular appeal to a person like me, Someone who knew herself well enough to know that money she could access easily was money she might find reasons to access. I set the transfer at $400 a month initially. Over the following year, as my income stabilized and I got a cost of living adjustment, I raised it to $600, then to $900, where it stayed for the remaining 5 years of the arrangement. My mother's name was on the account. So was mine. That is the detail that becomes important later. The anchor figure in this story was my great-uncle Cornelius, my father's mother's brother, 80 years old, a retired circuit court clerk who had spent 35 years processing legal documents in Cuyahoga County before retiring to a small house 12 minutes from my mother. He was a careful man in the specific way that people who have processed legal documents for 35 years are careful, attentive to the precise language of things, resistant to imprecision, constitutionally unable to let a misstatement pass without gentle correction. He had been the executor of my father's estate and had handled it with a thoroughness that my mother had relied on heavily and that I had watched and absorbed. Uncle Cornelius had always liked me. He called me on my father's birthday every year, not my own birthday, my father's, and we would talk for an hour about nothing in particular and everything important. He was the person in my family who had, over the preceding 2 years, asked me in the particular way he asked things whether I was keeping good records of the arrangement with my mother's account. I had said yes. He had said good. He had not elaborated, and I had not asked him to, because some conversations between careful people don't require elaboration. He would become the most important person in a room about 8 weeks after my furnace failed. The transfers ran cleanly for the first 2 years. I had set them up as automatic withdrawals, $900, first of the month from my checking account into the joint savings account my mother held. I did not receive statements from this account. My mother had set it up under her primary banking relationship, and the statements went to her address, and I had not asked to be added to the mailing list because the entire arrangement was premised on trust, and I did not want the act of requesting statements to signal that I didn't have it. I know how that sounds. I know it exactly. In year 2, I asked my mother, casually, how the balance was looking. She said it was growing nicely. She said something like $4,200 at that point, which tracked more or less with my sense of what 2 years of deposits would be at the amount I was contributing before I raised it to $900. I said good. I made a mental note to ask again in a year. I didn't ask again in a year. I was busy. The job had expanded. I was managing a larger portfolio of departmental budgets. I had bought the house. I was in a relationship that required attention. Life moved at the speed it moves, and the account existed in the background of my attention the way that safety nets tend to exist, reassuring precisely because you don't need to look at them. The first signal came in year 4. I was at my mother's house for a Sunday dinner, a regular occurrence, the kind of meal that anchors families who are trying to stay connected across the ordinary drift of adult lives. Deshawn and Tamsin were there. Bria was a toddler at that point and occupied the center of the meal's attention in the way that small children do. At some point in the evening, my mother mentioned that she had helped a neighbor with a car repair, a woman named Mrs. Holt who had been a family friend for 20 years and who had, apparently, been in a tight spot. The amount she mentioned was $800. I noted it. I did not comment. I told myself it was her own money, and that was her business. The second signal came 3 months later when my mother mentioned, again in passing, that she had replaced the water heater in her house. I asked what that had run her. She said it had been a good price. The contractor was someone Deshawn knew. She named a figure. I nodded. I was beginning, in the private accounting part of my brain that never entirely goes off duty, to run some arithmetic. Year 5 brought a third signal that was harder to file and forget. My mother took a trip, a church group trip to a resort in South Carolina, for nights, the kind of organized group travel that retired women sometimes do, and that is entirely reasonable. I was glad she was doing it. I asked how it was. She said, wonderful. I asked how she had managed the cost. She said she had used some money she'd been setting aside. I went home after that visit and I opened my laptop. I am a budget analyst. When I want to understand a financial situation, I build a spreadsheet. I started with what I knew: 68 months of deposits, the amounts by period, the estimated balance if no withdrawals had been made, and the account had accumulated at the bank's standard savings rate. I did not have access to the actual account statements. What I had was my own bank records showing every outgoing transfer, which was complete and unambiguous. The estimated balance, assuming no withdrawals, approximately $61,400. The water heater, Mrs. Holt's car repair, the resort trip. I was not doing forensic accounting. I was not building a case. I was just doing arithmetic on a quiet evening and noticing that the arithmetic was producing questions I wasn't ready to ask. I started saving my bank transfer records in a dedicated folder. I labeled it with a year and a neutral description. I added to it every month when the transfer cleared. I told myself I was just being organized. I was being organized. But I was also being something else, and I knew it. The furnace failed on a Thursday in January. I woke up at 6 in the morning, and the house was 49 degrees, and the furnace was making a sound that heating systems make when they are communicating that their useful life has concluded. I called the HVAC company I used. They came that afternoon. The diagnosis was final. The heat exchanger had cracked. The unit was too old to repair economically, and a replacement would run $2,200 to $2,400 depending on the model. They could install within 48 hours. $2,200 was not an amount that would have destabilized my finances. I had savings. What I did not want to do was drain my primary savings account for a home repair when I had a dedicated emergency fund that existed specifically for this situation. That was the point of the emergency fund. That was why I had been depositing $900 a month for 6 years. I called my mother at 4:30 that afternoon. She picked up on the third ring, and I explained the situation. Furnace failed. January in Cleveland. Repair cost. The plan to draw from the emergency account. I asked her to initiate a transfer to my checking account for $2,200. She said, "Oh, Wren." The way she said it had a quality I recognized in retrospect as preparation, the sound of someone buying a second to decide how to frame something. She said, "That account is a little tied up right now. I've got some things moving around, and the timing isn't great." I said, "Tied up how?" "It's a savings account," she said. I know. It's just give me a couple of weeks and I'll sort it out. In the meantime, you have your savings you'll manage." I said, "Mom, my furnace is broken. It's January." She said, "I know, honey. I'm sorry about the timing. A couple of weeks, I promise." I said, "Okay." I ended the call. I want to tell you about the next 20 minutes because they are the center of this story, even though nothing dramatic happened in them. I sat on my couch in my coat because the house was 49 degrees. I looked at the wall. I thought about the phrase tied up. I thought about what it means for a savings account to be tied up, which is, financially speaking, essentially nothing. A savings account is not an investment account. It does not have lockup periods. It does not move around. The money is either there or it isn't. I opened my laptop. I navigated to the bank's website. I entered my own login credentials. I was, after all, a joint account holder, and I accessed the account directly for the first time in 6 years. The current balance was $411. I sat with that number for a moment. Then I scrolled to the transaction history. The withdrawals went back for years. Not in large amounts. That was the first thing I noticed professionally, with the part of my brain that processes financial patterns. They were in amounts between $400 and $1,200. Irregular intervals. No single one was large enough to trigger an automatic notification. Taken together, across 47 months, they added up to $64,389. Plus the $411 remaining, plus my own deposits, $64,800. I closed the laptop. I sat in my cold house for a while longer. Then I called Uncle Cornelius. He picked up on the second ring and said, "Wren." Just my name, in the way of someone who has been waiting for a call without knowing exactly when it would come. I told him what I had found. I told him the balance, the withdrawal pattern, the total. He was quiet in the specific way he was quiet when he was thinking precisely. Then he said, "You have your own login to that account?" I said yes. He said, "Then you can request the full printed transaction history from the branch. Every withdrawal, dated, with whatever memo or identifier exists on each one." I said, "I know." He said, "Do that this week. Bring it to me." I said, "What are we doing with it?" He said, "Deshaun has been talking about organizing a family meeting. He wants to discuss the property, your mother's house, estate planning, what happens with assets long term. He mentioned it to me last month. I've been waiting to see when it would actually be scheduled." I said, "When is it?" He said, "I'll call him tomorrow and suggest we set a date. 6 weeks, maybe 8. Enough time for you to have everything in order." I went to the branch the next morning. I requested the full printed transaction history for the account going back to its opening. The teller, a young man who was professionally pleasant and who gave no indication that he found anything unusual about the request, printed 31 pages and handed them to me in an envelope. I drove home and I sat at my kitchen table and I read all 31 pages. Then I built the spreadsheet. By the time I was done, it was nearly midnight. The house was warm. I had called the HVAC company from a hotel I checked into for 2 nights, paid for my primary savings, and the new furnace had been installed by the time I returned. I looked at the spreadsheet one more time. Then I saved it, printed 2 copies, put them in an envelope, and called Uncle Cornelius to tell him I was ready. The 8 weeks between my discovery and the family meeting were among the more unusual periods of my adult life, in the specific sense that I was required to behave entirely normally in the presence of the person I had found out something significant about. I visited my mother for Sunday dinner twice during that period. I called her on her regular schedule, asked about her health, her church group, the neighbor Mrs. Holt. I did not mention the account. I did not mention the furnace repair beyond saying it had been handled. She did not bring up either subject, which told me she had concluded that the situation had resolved itself in the way she had suggested it would, that I had managed, that the discomfort had passed, that the conversation was over. Deshaun called me 3 weeks after my discovery to say he had been thinking about getting the family together to talk about their mother's house, specifically about the mortgage, which had 12 years remaining, and whether it made sense to discuss estate planning given their mother's age and the asset involved. He said Uncle Cornelius had mentioned it might be worth having a proper conversation with everyone present. I said it sounded like a good idea. I said I'd be there. He asked if I was doing okay, a brother's question, the kind that doesn't always require an honest answer. I said I was fine. I said I had had a situation with my furnace in January, but it was sorted. He said he hadn't heard about that. I said it was handled, nothing major. I want to say something about Deshaun here because he becomes important at the meeting, and I want you to understand who he is before you see how he responds. Deshaun is not a subtle person. He is direct, warm, occasionally blunt, and has a strong sense of fairness that is not complicated by sentiment. He would have been, in different circumstances, a very effective person to have in a conversation like the one that was coming. He was also completely unaware, as far as I could tell, of any of what I had found. He had organized the meeting because he was practical and because the question of the family home was a real one. He was not, in other words, an ally I had recruited. He was simply a person who had created the occasion. Uncle Cornelius and I spoke twice during the 8 weeks. The conversations were brief and practical. He confirmed he would be there. He confirmed he had reviewed the transaction history I had sent him. He said the pattern of withdrawals was clear and the documentation was complete. He said he would come as himself, a retired court clerk, a family elder, the executor of my father's estate, and a man with 35 years of experience with financial documents who had read the account history and could speak to what it showed. He said, "I'm not going to make a speech, Wren. I'm going to answer questions if I'm asked." I said, "What if no one asks?" He said, "Someone will ask." The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at Deshaun and Tamsin's house, a practical choice, since it was larger than my mother's apartment and centrally located for everyone. Deshaun had set it up as an informal family meeting. Him and Tamsin, my mother, Uncle Cornelius, me. That was the list. 5 people and a dining room table and the matter of the family home. I drove to Cleveland's east side on a Saturday in late March with the envelope on the passenger seat and the particular settled focus I carry into rooms where I know what I'm going to say before I arrive. Deshaun and Tamsin's house was warm and smelled like the coffee Tamsin had made, and Bria was at her grandmother's for the day, which meant the house had the particular quality of a space that has been cleared for adult conversation. Tamsin had put out a plate of things to eat and water glasses at the places around the dining room table in the way that people do when they want an informal meeting to feel organized. I arrived to find Uncle Cornelius already there, seated at the far end of the table with a cup of coffee and his reading glasses in his breast pocket. He looked at me when I came in and gave a small nod that contained everything he intended to communicate before the meeting started. My mother arrived 10 minutes after me. She came in with the ease of a woman who had organized family logistics for 30 years and was comfortable at any table. She hugged me. She asked if I'd been sleeping enough, a mother's question, always, and I said yes and poured her a glass of water. She sat across from me. She did not look at the envelope I had placed beside my chair. Deshawn opened the meeting at 2 o'clock with the practical directness that was characteristic of him. He said he wanted to talk about the house, what the remaining mortgage looked like, what the family's thinking was about long-term, whether it made sense to have any kind of formal arrangement in place. He said he wasn't trying to make it complicated, just wanted everyone on the same page. My mother said she appreciated it, that she'd been meaning to think about these things. Uncle Cornelius said he was glad the family was having the conversation, that these were the kinds of discussions that estates and attorneys handled much more smoothly when they'd been started before they were urgent. Deshawn nodded. He had a yellow legal pad and had written a few things on it. He walked through the mortgage balance. He'd called the servicer and gotten the payoff figure and the current assessed value of the property. He mentioned the possibility of a living trust. He asked if my mother had a current will. She said she did, that Uncle Cornelius had helped her update it 2 years after my father passed. Cornelius confirmed this. I let the conversation move. I sat with my hands in my lap, and I listened, and I let Deshawn run through his agenda because the agenda was real, and the questions were real, and they deserved real airtime. The house question mattered. The estate planning mattered. I was going to introduce something into this room, and I wanted it to arrive after the room had established its own natural order, not as an interruption of something important, but as a necessary addition to it. About 25 minutes in, Deshawn paused on the question of liquid assets, specifically whether their mother had a financial cushion beyond the house, because the estate planning question was in some ways connected to what other resources existed. My mother said she had some savings, that she was careful with money, that she managed well. Deshawn said, "Good. I just want to make sure we're not planning around something that isn't actually there." I reached down and picked up the envelope. Tamsin, who had been sitting beside Deshawn taking occasional notes on her phone, looked at the envelope. Her expression was the expression of someone whose ambient read of the room had just been updated. I said, "Before we go further on the liquid assets question, I need to share something that's directly relevant." I placed the envelope on the table and opened it. I took out 2 copies of the printed transaction history, 31 pages each, and set one in front of Uncle Cornelius and one in the center of the table. I kept the summary spreadsheet, which was a single page, in my hand. I said, 6 years ago, at my mother's suggestion, I began transferring $900 a month into a joint savings account that she managed. The purpose was a personal emergency fund, money I could access when I needed it for unexpected costs. My name is on the account as joint holder. I held up the summary page. Over 72 months, I deposited $64,800. When my furnace failed in January, I called my mother to access the funds. She told me the account was tied up. I placed the summary page on the table. I said, when I logged into the account directly, the balance was $411. I requested the full transaction history from the branch. I gestured to the 31 pages in the center of the table. The history shows 47 withdrawals over 4 years, ranging from $400 to $1,200 each. The total withdrawn is $64,389. The room was quiet. Not collectively quiet, individually quiet, which is different. Deshawn had stopped looking at his legal pad. He was looking at the summary page on the table with an expression that was doing several things at once: reading, computing, understanding, and then a kind of stillness that I recognized as the moment when comprehension completes itself and emotion hasn't yet decided what to do. Tamsin's hand had found his arm. Uncle Cornelius said, in the measured tone of a man who had reviewed these documents and was now confirming their contents for the room, "I've reviewed the full transaction history. The withdrawals are consistent, incremental, and span from month 14 of the account's existence through month 68. Each is below the threshold that typically triggers automatic account notifications. He removed his reading glasses from his breast pocket and set them on the table in front of him. The account was opened with both names on the title. The deposits, per the transaction record, originate from a single external account, Wren's. There are no deposits from any other source. Deshawn said, slowly, to no one specifically, $64,000. He looked at our mother, $64,000. I put the document in the folder where I kept the transaction history and the spreadsheet. I labeled the folder accurately and filed it. I did not expect to need it again. I hoped I wouldn't. My mother and I still have Sunday dinners. They are different now, more careful in some ways, more honest in others. She asks more direct questions about my finances than she used to, and I answer them, and there is something in that exchange that is working, slowly, toward a version of trust that is built on different materials than the previous one. Thinner materials in some ways, more durable in others. I think that might be how it goes when the original version turns out to have been built on something that wouldn't hold. Here is what I know now that I wish I had known when I was 25 and setting up that first transfer. Financial arrangements within families feel different from financial arrangements outside them. They feel like they don't require the same infrastructure, the same documentation, the same periodic review, the same shared access to the actual numbers. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes the infrastructure isn't necessary, but you do not know in advance which times those are. You only find out afterward, when the arrangement is over and you're holding the account history in your hands at midnight in a house that took 2 days to warm up. The thing I have come to believe is this: when money moves in a family, the documentation is not evidence of distrust. It is evidence of respect for the money, for the relationship, for the other person's accountability to you. Keeping records is not a cynical act. It is the act of someone who values the arrangement enough to want it to be accurate. I set up the joint account because I trusted my mother. I kept the records because I am who I am. And when the account turned out to be something other than what it was supposed to be, the records were the thing that made it possible to stand in a room full of family and say, here is what happened, here is what it cost, here is the accurate version. Not my memory against someone else's revision. The numbers. The numbers don't revise themselves. That is the one thing they have over memory, over intention, over the stories we tell about why things happened the way they did. That's my story. A joint account, a printed transaction history, and a dining room table in March that finally had all the numbers on it. Now here is what I want to ask you. Have you ever trusted a family member with access to your money, a joint account, a managed fund, even just a verbal agreement, and later found out the arrangement wasn't what you thought it was? How did you find out, and what did you do? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.